Welcome to the Old Roads Podcast, a podcast that seeks to bring the wisdom of the past to the challenges of the present. I am your host, Aaron O'Kelly. I'm a pastor and a theological educator. As we're looking at the pro-life movement in the month of April, the question I want to raise today is, what is causing division within the pro-life movement right now? On my shelf in my office, I have a book that is entitled Controversy of the Ages, authored by Ted Cable and Peter Razor. This is a book about issues related to the age of the earth and how we understand that in relation to the Bible. And so the argument that is made in this book is that it lays out the position of what is called young earth creationism, old earth creationism, and then a view called evolutionary creationism. So among those three movements, by the way, I'm going to get to the point here, but this is an illustration. Among those three movements, young earth, old earth, and evolutionary creationism, Cable and Razor point out that what tends to happen is that the young earth movement opposes itself against the other two. And the argument in their book is that actually the young earth creationist movement and the old earth creationist movement have more in common with each other than either does with the evolutionary creationist movement. And so it seems more natural that there should be an alliance between young earth creationism and old earth creationism against what's called evolutionary creationism. And so if you believe God created the world and made humanity directly, no matter how old you think the earth is, I think you have more in common with one another as believers than either of you might have in common with someone who holds to a Christian form of Darwinism. And I think the book makes that argument very well, and I highly recommend that book if you're interested in that issue. I see a similar dynamic at work right now in the issue of the pro-life movement. There are actually three positions, I think, now that we can outline on this. One of them is called abolitionism. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Of course, one is the traditional pro-life movement, and at this point, the abolitionists, even though they share much in common with the pro-life movement, they often do not call themselves pro-life. They want to distinguish themselves from the pro-life movement. And of course, the other view would be the pro-choice movement. What's ended up happening is that the abolitionists, similar to the way many young earth creationists operate, is the abolitionists have said, we oppose both the pro-life movement and the pro-choice movement. Just like the young earth creationists would say, we oppose both the old earth creationists and the evolutionary creationists. I want to make an argument that abolitionists and the pro-life movement should see themselves as allies against one common view, which is the pro-choice movement. They would be much more effective if they did, and I want to offer some suggestions about how they might be able to do so today. Well, let's talk about what abortion abolitionism is. I've talked about what the pro-life movement is. What do abolitionists believe, and what makes them want to distinguish themselves from the broader pro-life movement? Typically, and again, there may be any given representative of abolitionism who could say this differently, but I want to say what I've seen as a typical representation of this movement. I see it as having two major prongs. Number one, an abortion abolitionist would say incremental measures toward eliminating abortion are not acceptable. So let's take this example. Florida, I believe, recently had a bill that they passed that was a heartbeat bill, if I'm not mistaken. And if it wasn't Florida, I know a number of states have done this, but they passed a measure to restrict abortion after a fetal heartbeat could be detected. And so it protected unborn children from the point of heartbeat can be detected all the way through the end of pregnancy. So according to the abolitionist argument, that bill is not acceptable and should not be approved by anyone who wants to abolish abortion. Why? Because it actually allows for abortion until the heartbeat can be detected. And so as an incremental measure, it codifies an acceptable range of abortions. And if we want abortion to be abolished, we have to oppose it completely and cannot support any incremental measures at all. And so you can see how this would put them at odds with the pro-life movement in many cases. Pro-life people might often support a heartbeat bill, especially if that moves the ball forward. If the state previously has very little restriction on abortion and then has a bill in front of it to pass a measure to protect children after the detection of a heartbeat, then pro-life people typically say, hey, that's a great advance for our cause, let's support it. Abolitionists will tend to say, no, we cannot support that, we oppose it, because it codifies acceptable abortions before the heartbeat can be detected. It doesn't get us all the way to our goal, and so we cannot accept it as a compromise. That's one prong of the abolitionist movement. Another prong that's related to this is that the abolitionist movement argues that women who abort children should be held criminally liable for that. Currently, I'm not aware of any state that holds women criminally liable. Maybe there are some laws here or there, but I don't know that they're ever really enforced. But the pro-life movement on the whole has not favored this. The pro-life movement on the whole has favored criminal liability for abortion providers, but not for women who procure abortions. And so that's been another issue of contention between these two movements. So I'd like to talk through both of those issues, reflect on those from my own perspective, and then offer what I think is a way forward for abolitionists and the pro-life movement to work together. Let's go to that first issue that I mentioned, incremental measures. The abolitionist would say incremental measures on abortion are not acceptable. They are compromised, and therefore we cannot affirm them or support them. I actually disagree with that. I think incremental measures are often necessary. Incremental measures are the way societies change. I don't know that there's really ever a dramatic change on an issue that's become this widespread that we can say, it could all change at one time. Incremental measures are simply the way societies change. So let's say, for example, let's say an abolitionist could become emperor immediately and could impose his will on the United States of America. Let's say he's the American emperor. He can impose his will on the United States by an act of fiat directly in one day, and he decides, I'm going to impose a law that outlaws all abortions across the board. Now, that'd be a good thing in theory, but in practice, I highly doubt that it would be all that effective, because laws imposed on a population, when that population doesn't understand those laws or support them, they are inherently fragile. And so they become very difficult to enforce. You'll have lower level people in the government who don't believe in those laws and who are therefore willing to look the other way when they're violated, or willing to get creative about working around them, about finding call it a black market to make sure that that law is really not being obeyed. Think about what happened in the United States with prohibition. The amendment to the Constitution was passed that forbade the sale of alcoholic beverages, and yet what happened? Alcohol was still being sold, and it was happening all over the place. It just went underground. And because prohibition became impossible to enforce, the United States ended up repealing that amendment and ending that experiment in prohibition. The same could be true here. If we simply go straight to outlawing everything all at once, I don't know that that's really going to be all that effective, because, again, you cannot enforce effectively a law that the population to some degree has not really bought into. And so you end up in a very fragile situation. I do share the goal that abortion be abolished, but I want it to be abolished effectively, not ineffectively. And I think incremental progress is essential to getting there. Any kind of steps we can take that make it feel less and less normal for women to get abortions will be the way of moving the ball forward. I think of the fight for life more like a football game. The abortion abolitionists would say, we always have to throw straight to the end zone. We're on the 20-yard line, our own 20. We have to throw for the end zone. Nothing else is acceptable. And unless we get to the end zone in one play, then nothing else can be done. I would say, no, let's be satisfied with running the ball forward a few yards at a time. Let's be satisfied with moving the ball toward the goal rather than thinking the only way to get there is all at once. So I do not agree that incremental measures are not acceptable. I think they're actually necessary, and we should be willing. And that may, if you're an abortion abolitionist, that may cause you to tune me out at this point. And if that's the case, so be it. But I just think you're wrong on this issue. I think incremental measures are actually necessary to move the ball forward in society. Now, on that second point, women who abort children should be held criminally liable. Is that something that is morally defensible? The pro-life movement tends to say no. The pro-life movement tends to say that we cannot pursue holding women criminally liable for abortion. And they will often argue this. They will say there are two victims of abortion. There's the unborn child and there's the woman as well. Is it true to say there are two victims of abortion? Let's evaluate that claim. Yes, in some cases, there are two victims of abortion. If a woman has been coerced into having an abortion, and we know that happens, if a woman has been coerced against her will into having an abortion, then yes, she's a victim. She has not done anything wrong. She has been victimized in that process. But that's not every abortion. If a woman has been outright deceived, she has simply no ability to understand, or actually has no understanding because of deception. She's simply been deceived into doing what she's done. Now, there may be some culpability in the deception, but we can understand she's also a victim of the deception. But let's ask this, is the existence of the abortion industry itself, that I think that's typically what is meant by two victims of abortion, the fact that there is an industry out there that promotes abortion and it pulls women into it, that's what makes her the victim. Does that make her a victim in the sense that it removes her moral agency? Now, here's something I really want pro-life people to listen to. Does that remove her moral agency? And I think if you're thinking carefully, you'd say, no, of course not. And I think the pro-life movement gets that when we preach the gospel to these women who've had abortions. And we tell them, confess that sin to God and seek His forgiveness. Right? If you tell a woman you've had an abortion, you sinned, you need to seek the Lord's forgiveness, then you're telling her, you're not purely a victim here. That is already being presupposed in preaching the gospel to her. If you tell her you are purely a victim, you leave her without any hope, because she can't repent of victimhood, but she can repent of sin. So if you want to keep preaching the gospel to women who need Christ's forgiveness for the sin of abortion, then you have to be willing to name her sin as sin. And if it is sin, and if it is murder, then it should be in some way recognized by the law as such in a just society. That's my reasoning. In a just society, whatever is legal murder, and we argue abortion should be regarded that way, has to have some kind of criminal punishment attached to it. So, here I find myself in agreement with the abolitionist movement to a certain point. I would agree with abolitionists saying that the goal in a just society is that all human beings should have equal protection under the law. And we should not obscure this issue behind the victimhood status of a woman who gets an abortion. Yes, some of them are victims in a pure sense that removes all their moral culpability, but many of them are not. And even those who are to some degree deceived by a godless industry, they're no more deceived about that than others are deceived about other sins for which they are fully guilty. So there's a culpable kind of victimhood as well. So there's victimhood that's purely innocent, a woman coerced into having an abortion, but then there's also victimhood of allowing yourself to be deceived by the lies of an industry that is pushing this stuff. And in one case, there'd be no culpability, in the other, there would at least be some. And then, of course, for some women, they abort their babies knowing full well what they're doing, and they celebrate it, and they shout their abortions, and they proclaim it, and they try to promote it as a good thing. And I think in a just society, the law would have some kind of penalty attached to that kind of behavior if we really are going to say all human beings must be legally protected under the law. That is a just principle. And I agree with abolitionists, that is a principle that we must pursue. Now, how can that be obtained? How can we attain that goal of equal protection under the law for the unborn? Here's where I probably disagree with abolitionists. Should we immediately jump to imposing the death penalty on women who have abortions Let's say tomorrow, let's pass a new law that says women who have abortions should be subject to the death penalty. Again, that would be similar to what I said under number 1. That would be trying to immediately throw toward the end zone. And that would be imposing something on a society that doesn't understand or buy into the reasoning that's behind that. That would be doing something inherently fragile, and it would cause, I think, more problems than it would solve. So I'm not in favor of saying, let's swing for the fence today, let's throw for the end zone today on this issue. I think on this issue as well, progress will have to be incremental. And certainly, let's not even think about retroactive penalties. Women who've already had abortions under a different legal reality, I don't think it serves anyone's interest for us to say, let's now think about imposing retroactive penalties on them. You cannot manage a society that operates that way, that will one day change a law and start imposing penalties retroactively. I think that, again, creates a lot of problems as well. So, what do we need to do moving forward on the issue of equal protection? I think, in my view, we should start in small ways. If you want to attach criminal liability to abortion for the women who procure it, and I think we should, as a society, look in that direction. Maybe start with the fines. Maybe start with just imposing some kind of legal recognition that you broke the law, and that has to go punished. And that seems to be especially needed in a day when a woman can order an abortion through the mail, and there really is no provider that the state she lives in necessarily can go after. So start with some kind of legal recognition and get it into our minds. The law is a teacher. And so as the law teaches, yes, this is wrong, this has moral culpability, then from there you can build on that and move forward at future stages to make it more and more serious under the law. But for those who are ministering to women, those who are serving women in our crisis pregnancy centers and in other avenues, I can understand why you're not out there saying, we need to punish women. We need to punish the women. I know that your primary audience is those women. And so you're caught in a situation where you want to have an audience with them. You want them to trust you. You want to have an avenue to preach the gospel to them and to help them. And that's a very important thing. And so I understand why a crisis pregnancy center has to be operating on a different wavelength, so to speak, or on a different prong of the pro-life movement. I think a crisis pregnancy center almost has to remove itself from the legal arena here. The crisis pregnancy center just focuses on the women and says, whatever the law is going to be what it's going to be. But our role is to minister to the woman no matter what. We're not going to get involved in the legal arena. We're going to leave that to others. But we're going to focus on what our mission is. We have this prong of the movement, and this is what we're responsible for, so we're going to do that well. And let those who are involved in the legal arena do their thing over there and look at ways to make our society more just. I think if we blend those two fields together, we are setting each field up to oppose the other. And that's why I think abortion abolitionism and the pro-life movement are at odds right now, because we're trying to put different prongs of the movement into the same sphere. And we really don't have to do that. We can let the crisis pregnancy centers do what they do, and we don't expect them to do what they don't do. We just tell them, don't focus on the legal issue, just focus on the women, because you're doing a great job. Continue to do so. And we know you've got to have a hearing with those women, so you don't need to be out on the forefront calling for their imprisonment. But on the other hand, in the halls of our state legislatures and in our legal movements and in our think tanks, we need people who are working on another prong of the movement, who are thinking, how do we move our society toward greater justice in its legal code? How do we make the law protect human beings equally? And how do we get there? What are the steps needed to get there? I suspect that many abolitionists, if you're listening to this, you may not agree with me and you may write me off as saying I'm too compromised. And if that's the case, you're free to draw that conclusion. But I would argue we can have a lot more unity and strength as a movement if we can get together between the abolitionists and the pro-life movement. And the ways that we get together is by letting the prongs of our movement do what they do. Let them be distinct from one another and focus on what they need to focus on to continue advancing the ball forward. If we can do that, then I think we'll see greater progress in the future, and a less fractured movement for the fight to defend life. If you benefited from our podcast, would you consider subscribing on your favorite podcast app? Leave us a 5-star review, and most importantly, share this podcast with a friend who could benefit from listening. And I'd love to receive your questions for our monthly Q&A episodes, so send those to me at theoldroadspodcast.com. You can also sign up there to be a patron who can support this ministry financially, and I'm very thankful to all of you who are patrons. Until next time, remember Jeremiah 6:16, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls."